Hey guys, this is Kelsey Grace, and this is my data analysis on number identification scores. So for the data that I analyzed this week, this comes from my Acadience Math progress monitoring data that I do with my students. The skill that I was progress monitoring them on was number identification. So this data is quantitative. You will see my notations that I put in their booklets too. So the pictures are going to show the booklets that I record in, which is why I have my chicken scratch and notations that I can explain. And when the students are doing this, they have a separate binder where they look at a separate page with numbers on it, and I just record the numbers that they are saying all within 1 minute. And in this data collection and the data that I analyze, it includes my biweekly students. So those are students that I monitor biweekly. They came in well below the benchmark. And then it also includes some monthly students that I monitor monthly because they came in just below the benchmark for number identification. So without further ado, this is my first student. So as you see up at the top, I always date my progress monitoring. This was well before I knew that I was going to be using this and sharing this information with anybody. So my notations are my own chicken scratch, but I will go through and explain kind of what those things mean for you guys. So I indicated on this progress monitoring booklet for student A, where there are red arrows, for a self-correction, it does not count as an incorrect error or an incorrect answer. So I always put an SC and circle that, and that's just what you see there. Usually what I will do, if a student gets it wrong, they get it circled. If they say something instead of that number, I will note that beside the number. And if they just skip the number, I circle it. If they get it correct, I typically do not note anything on the booklet. So as you see, this student, as they were going across, they had a couple self-corrections that they made. I always put a bracket where they finish within the minute. And there's, for one example, for the number 79, instead of saying 79, they said 79. For the number 20, they said 20, but I put question marks because they were confused when they said it. And then they went on to say 20-ish. So I just note exactly what they tell me, and then I go back later at a later time to analyze this data. So for student A, I put a couple of things. So this student is showing that they're still not confident with number identification. They're making various kinds of mistakes with various types of numbers. So for example, they in some of the numbers, they were switching the digits, which is a common mistake. So instead of saying 93, they said 39. This is common for students to do, especially in first grade. A lot of times students struggles with their 20s, numbers in the 20s and saying those, or they struggle with the teen numbers. Those are always really, really hard numbers. This student is also misreading single digit numbers. So if they were struggling with one thing and getting one thing incorrect, maybe it's all of their 20s. That kind of narrows it down and helps me assess what is wrong and where they're making errors, and then we can help in that area. But for this student, they're making kind of mistakes all across the board, so they're still not confident with their number identification. And this means that I just need to make sure they continue to practice number identification and all of the skills that kind of encapsulate that. So whether it's single digits, double digits, 20s, teens, all of those things they need experience with continuously. And if I look at another student, for student B, I just put an arrow at the very top, so I did note that this student struggled with their teens. If you do look at their booklet, I did not have to circle. They didn't miss any teen numbers, so this helps me because it tells me that as they were reading these numbers, maybe they hesitated a little bit for every teen number that they went to. So I tend to write myself these little notes. And this student, when I was progress monitoring them, when they would come across 16 or 17 or 15, that's exactly what they were doing. They were hesitating before those numbers, so they're showing me that maybe they're not as confident with the teen numbers, but they're still able to read them correctly. Only made 2 mistakes. So kind of my analysis of this student is that they're progressing really well with their number identification. So this one I got to include the total score. So they ended up for this progress monitoring getting a 36. The beginning of the year benchmark for first grade is 27. So they're actually meeting and going well above the benchmark for that. They're making a common mistake. The one that they made was switching the two digits. Again, common in first grade. So instead of 12, they said 21. Not really concerned about that, especially because it only happened one time. And I believe that in context, the student would have gotten this correct. So they're just looking at a page full of numbers. I think that if I had this, if it was on a number line, they would have gotten it correct. Or had it been in a number story, they would have gotten that number correct. So moving on to student C, this one I indicated I had to note their progress monitoring book a little bit differently. I still circled the ones they got incorrect. I still wrote beside what they said instead. However, this student started, instead of going across the rows and reading each number, as they're asked to do, they started jumping around the page. So if it has a line underneath of it, like those red arrows are showing, those are numbers they told me and they did get them correct. If you look very carefully, the numbers they were telling me, they don't go higher than 20. So at a closer analysis of this student, it was a really concerning progress monitoring event. They are still struggling tremendously with their number identification to the point that they didn't even attempt a number above a 20. So it shows that they have really low confidence in this skill. They started out trying and they got to the number 23 and they didn't know it. And so that is one that I gave to them. After 3 seconds, I give them the number. And then they just decided, you know what, I'm just going to jump around the page and say the numbers that I know instead of actually trying. And, we've been in first grade now for, I'm not sure, maybe like 10 weeks, more than that, since August, end of August. So they've had a lot of experience with numbers and we talk about them all the time. So it was concerning to me that they didn't even try to attempt reading these 2-digit numbers. So also when they got to the second page, they were saying incorrect numbers that don't even match the digits of the actual answer. So I see this in students a lot who really just are not confident and are really, really struggling. I'm going to go back really quickly so you can kind of see, like for the number 39, they said 18. Well, 39 and 18 have no digits in common. So even just like mistakes like that, there's no really rhyme or reason. It's just that they're not confident in this skill. If I move to student D, again, you'll see kind of my self-correct boxes. There's 2 of them there. So it's kind of tough to see. You'll notice the pattern for this student. They struggle with those teen numbers. They confuse them with their tens. This is because when you say numbers like 16 and 60, us who know those numbers can say them quickly and determine which is which. But for students who are learning these, they very commonly mistake 16 and 60, or they will say the number incorrectly because they have not had enough experience. And I noticed this a lot with my ELL students. I can't determine if this was one of my ELL students or not, but that is just a common thread that I've noticed in first grade, that the ELL students really struggle with this, but there are others that struggle with it too. So my analysis on student D is just that the student needs practice with their teens and their tens, both separated and then together and in context. So I noted too that this is a lot of times a language component, just deciphering 17 and 7D and enunciating those number names. I really make it a point, I will say 17 and I make them repeat me, and then 7D whenever we're working on those, and I make them repeat me again, and then we practice them together. So something else I noticed that they're still switching digits around. 21, they said 12. Again, a common mistake in first grade, as you're seeing with all of these students who are below benchmark with number identification. It's common, but with other mistakes, it just shows that they have to continue to practice this skill, So I know that I have to hone in on the teens and the tens with this student, but I also know, and I'm seeing that they're showing me other mistakes, so they just all around need more experience and more practice with their number identification. And this is my last student that I have. This is student E. First glance on their paper, you see a lot of numbers are circled. They said a lot of things incorrectly. And on first glance, you might be like, I have no idea, why they said some of those things. We are seeing some mistakes from student D, actually, where they're saying 50 instead of 15, 7D instead of 17. 30 instead of 13. So we're seeing that mistake, which again, common in first grade, but need to work on that with this student. But there's something else, and this is because I know the student, something else that they are making a mistake of, and somebody who would actually sit down and look at this and really analyze their data would notice this as well. This student made so many mistakes because they're confusing the digits 8 and 9. This is an area that my student knows that they struggle in, and they are still not confident identifying 8 and 9, and therefore they mistake them in the two-digit numbers. So if I go back to that bigger picture, you might be able to pick some out now. So for example, for 19, they said 18. For 28, they said 29. For 93, they said 83. So somewhere along the lines, this is actually my first time that I've had this, that a student truly does not know the difference between 8 and 9. But somewhere along the lines last year in kindergarten, this was just something that was not resolved. So just kind of something that we're left with in first grade. So I really, really need to make sure that they have explicit instruction on digits 8 and digit 9. That they truly understand what those symbols mean, attach it to the values of the numbers, and unfortunately they're only one away, so they're going to be beside each other in the number line. They're going to be beside each other on the number grid, which is probably why this student has continued to struggle with those two. But overall, just I love analyzing their data, especially for their number identification. I think it's kind of like putting pieces of the puzzle together. You see the student struggling in math, but whenever you sit down and you look at their data all in just a minute's worth of time, you really see the exact digits or the numbers or the mistakes that they're making, and then you just get to help them resolve those mistakes. So I hope that you enjoyed my data analysis.